book of Samuel is a historical document, all right? It's a book of history. It tells us things that happened in the world, right? And so when you read through this book, you're going to hear all kinds of names. You're going to hear all kinds of places. And the author just assumes you know who they are and why they're important in the story. Okay, and so a lot of times, we're 3,000 years removed from this particular story, and so much of the context has been lost to us. So that's what I really want to start with. Okay, so the first thing to point out is that timeline setting here for the book of Samuel is 1100 to 970 BC. It's essentially the end of the time period of the judges, all the way to the death of King David. All right, and so that's the time frame that the books of Samuel are covering here. Okay. There's a lot of different things that are going on here, and it's so when we are dealing with history, we really it's really hard to talk about history in a linear fashion. All right, and the reason for that is because there's a whole bunch of different cultural and political factors that go into any particular history, right? And so we're going to talk about some of these issues here, but when you're talking about a particular civilization or a particular group of people, it's easy to speak to them in a very generic way, in a linear fashion. All right, the Israelites did this, and then they did this, and then they did this. All right, but once you start to bring them into sort of a broader picture, especially what's going on in the ancient Near East, you have different cultures that are interacting with each other, and then you go, okay, well, the Israelites met with the Egyptians. Okay, well, who are the Egyptians, right? And what do they have to do with the story? And then you have to backtrack and talk about who they are, why they're important to the story, right? And so there's a lot of different factions that are involved in Israel's story, and some of them don't actually even show up in the story. All right, they're just there in the background, and they do have influence on the story. Okay, and so we're going to take a look at a lot of these external factors. Okay. There's also two other things that need to be understood. Okay, so you have in front of you that sort of blank sheet. It's just a map with no writing on it. It's the Mediterranean. And so there are a couple of external factors that we really have to be aware of in the history of Israel. Okay. The first one is the Fertile Crescent. Okay, and the Fertile Crescent is this area between the Tigris, actually goes like this: Tigris, Euphrates, all right, and then it goes down into Israel over here. Okay, and so why is it called the Fertile Crescent? It's called the Fertile Crescent because it's the only fertile land in the area, and it's where it's the most abundant part of life, right? Okay, or the most abundant life-giving soil that's out there, all right? And so much of civilization, all right, in the ancient world is trying to occupy this territory, right? Why? Because that's where you can live, all right? And so it makes sense that that's where you want to be, okay? And so in addition to this, we also have this territory down here at the bottom, right? This is the Egyptian Nile, okay? And it's also extremely fertile, right? And so that's another place where people want to be, all right? So cultures are naturally going to start to settle there and grow out of there, okay? All right, and so sort of the cultural political situation here in the ancient Near East is that people are vying for this territory, right? They're vying for the Nile, and they're vying for the Fertile Crescent. It's where you want it to be. Now, another issue that's going on here is this land right here, and this is going to be the land of Israel. We'll talk about that a little bit more. We'll talk about that in depth later on. And why this is important is because after you have life, right? So you've got the ground to grow the food and raise the goats and chickens on, right? Once you have that established, the next thing you want is prosperity, right? Okay, you want to trade with other people. You want to grow your kingdom. You want to go to war with people, right, and take their stuff. Okay, and so how do you do that? Well, in the ancient Near East, the only real way to do that was to go through this land right here. All right. Oftentimes, historians and archaeologists will refer to Israel as the land between. Okay. Okay. Why is it the land between? Because it's the land between the major power brokers in the region. Okay. It's the land between the superpowers, as it were. All right, Israel never really is a superpower, right? In its history, it has some highlights, but it's really more just the land that the superpowers move through, and everybody wants to own this piece of land in order that their kingdom will prosper. Okay, all right, so now we'll take a look at some of the just sort of history and archaeology of the area of the ancient Near East. Okay, as we're talking about history and dating, I'm gonna be giving you some dates here. Take them all with a grain of salt. Okay, it's not that they're super inaccurate or anything like that, but the problem with dating things is that we don't, sometimes we really have a hard time finding a very solid piece of history to tie something to. All right, so for us, it's not real hard, right? Because the problem is when you jump on the other side of Jesus's birth, people weren't going, okay, this happened, 30 years before Jesus was born. Nobody knew Jesus was coming. All right, and so instead they date things based on the reigns of kings, typically. Problem is that our records aren't as sufficient as we'd like for them to be, and further, sometimes kings overlap in their in the years that they work, right? And so so if you've got kings that are on the throne at the same time, or the son sits on the throne at the same time that the king, the father is there, and it says, oh, in the 8th year of the son's reign. Well, was that 8 years after the father died, or 8 years after he ascended to the throne with the father? I don't know, right? And so bear that in mind. Now, having said all of that, I think that a lot of what we're going to talk about here is pretty accurate. It's accurate enough for our purposes. Okay. All right. And also another. Oh yeah, and archaeology. That's another thing too. This is why so many people can write papers on history, is because we just simply don't know enough stuff, right? And so archaeology is really a field that's based on a very little bit of information, and then they extrapolate from there, right? And so the foundation of what they're talking about is very narrow, and then they move on, all right? When we talk about history, all right, outside of Scripture, when we talk about history, what we're really talking about is people's interpretation of documents and archaeological evidence that has been left behind, all right, for us to look at. And that's what we're really talking about, because the actual history itself is not there for us. We cannot witness it, experience, see it, right? It's gone. All right. I'll give you an example of how this can and does play out, right? Say you have a village, and in the village they build some houses, and they use some timbers, right? And one guy builds his house on one side of the village with brand new timbers that he just cut down, right? And he puts his house up. On the other side of the village, 700-800 feet away, another guy builds a house, but he doesn't use new timbers. Instead, he drags some old timbers in that are from an old temple or something like that are couple hundred years old, and he brings them in and he builds his house. And then there's an earthquake a few hundred years later, the whole thing falls down and then buried in the sand, right? And then 3,000 years later, we come along and we excavate the city, and then we see, well, oh man, this guy's got timbers that are 200 years newer than this guy's timber. So what are we going to say about the house? Or what are we going to say? Well, this part of the city is newer than this part of the city, right? Well, not necessarily. Maybe, all right, but we don't know for certain, okay? And so that's just a real brief example of take everything with a grain of salt, because we really don't know. Having said that, there are lots of things that we can know. Okay. All right. So now we're just going to go ahead and just do a real quick run through of the sort of political climate that is going on during this period. Okay, and so I'm gonna run through this real quick, and I'm not going to give you a like in-depth history of each of the players in the game. And so, but with that said, there's one thing that you can the political climate of the situation that's going on right now is easy to summarize in this phrase: while the cat's away, the mice will play. Okay, all right, and that's really what's going on here. The big players are away, and so the little players are playing. Okay, and so we're going to start with the cats and see who are the big cats in the game. Okay, and why they're not there anymore. All right, so the first one is Egypt. Okay, so we all know where Egypt is. It's down here on the Nile. All right. Okay, so they're the first big player in the game. Their civilization is old, really old, right? 3000 BC or before that. Some historians and archaeologists think they were in and around 6000 BC. We're not really sure, but those are the dates of the beginning. The pyramids, the Great Pyramids in Giza, you're looking at 2700 to 2000 BC. Okay, so if you remember, we're talking about the 1100 BC time frame. So this is almost 1,000 years before that. I'm sorry, almost 1,600 years before that. Okay, and then sort of connecting Israel to this, Israel goes into Egypt about 1850 BC. So this is Joseph in Israel in around 1850 BC. Okay. All right, and so this sort of begins our connection with Israel and Egypt. So the people of Israel are in Egypt. They settle there because of a famine. We know that whole story. All right, and so after they've been there for a while, about 1730, a group of people arise in Egypt called the Hyksos. They're shepherd kings, is what that word means. And most likely they're a people group from the land of Canaan, from where Israel will be. Okay, they're there until about 1570. Okay, ish. All right, and what they did was they basically disrupted the whole political climate there. After they get booted out, all right, another group of people come in to this, and they're called the 18th dynasty. The point here is that Israel comes in, all right, and then another people group shows up who's completely different from the one that Israel came in through, right? They're Canaanites, all right, which sort of has a connection to Abraham because that's the land that he came from. He's not Canaanite, but that's the land he came from, all right? And then those people get booted out, and now you have a new group of people, the 18th dynasty. And the first ruler there is called Thutmose, okay? All right. And then the connection there is Exodus 1, verses 8 to 9. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. All right. And so this gives us sort of the groundwork for the Exodus, right? And so the new king, whoever it is, it's probably not Thutmose, but these people did not have any understanding of who Joseph was or who the people of Israel are, or even why they were there in the first place, right? And so that sort of lays the groundwork for the Exodus. So the Israelites are there; they're being oppressed. All right, and then we get the Exodus in 1446. Now you might say 1446 BC. That's a very specific time for the Exodus. Well, the reason why we know that date is because the Bible tells us that date. Okay, all right. So we know the dates of of the rulership of Solomon. Okay, and in 1 Kings 6:1, this is what it says. All right, in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. Right, and so just in this little sort of aside where Solomon's building the temple, he tells us it's 480 years since they left the land of Egypt. All right, and so since we know the reign of Solomon from history, we can just say, oh, okay, well, that goes to 1446, all right, BC, okay? And so then from there, Egypt leaves 1446. They wander around in the Sinai for 40 years, all right? And then they enter into the land of Israel in 1406 BC, and that's when with the conquest of Jericho, okay? All right, and so after Israel leaves, they actually regain their power. All right, and under some of the kings that are the pharaohs of this time, all right, they are able to actually go in and occupy and control much of the land in between. You might say, well, why don't we have any conflict with Egypt during the book of Judges? And the answer to that question is because Egypt and Israel were not interested in the same things at this time. Or to put it this way, the Israelites hadn't gotten to the point where they conquered the entire territory of Israel or of the Promised Land yet. Just to sort of briefly show this to you, if you take a look at this map that I gave you, this is the territory that the judges own right up to the time where right before the time of Saul, King Saul. All right. Okay, and so the sort of tan areas are the areas that they don't control. Now, here's the thing about the tan areas. The tan areas are where the major coastal highways are, right? So the road of trade is going through here, right? And so if you see this area right in the center where it's also tan, that's the Jezreel Valley. Okay, and that is the valley that leads over to the King's Highway, which goes up to Assyria. And so essentially, if you look at this bigger map, right, they own the road that goes this way, and they own the road that goes this way. And this way is going up to trade into Anatolia or Asia Minor, and this way is going to trade with the Assyrians. Okay, and so the Israelites didn't own anything that the Egyptians needed. All right. Okay, not at that time. So the Egyptians, at least not at that moment in time, weren't really interested in what the Israelites were doing. Instead, they were trying to control the trade routes. Okay, all right, and so then out of all this, Egypt ends up in a battle with another major player called the Hittites, and they are located up here in Asia Minor, also called Anatolia. They have a battle with the Hittites up here in 1274, and that battle essentially weakens both kingdoms, and this is what ends up causing Egypt to not be a major player during the time frame that we're going to look at. Okay. All right, and so that's Egypt, right? Why aren't they around? Why aren't they a big player? Because they had a big battle with the Hittites, and things didn't go well for either group. Okay. All right, so then the second major player, the second cat in the game, is the Hittites. All right, okay. They are not the Hittites of the earlier in Scripture. We have some mentions throughout early Scripture of a group of Hittites. These are not the same people. All right, there's a lot of ites in the Bible. Okay, and most of them are just different people groups that are Canaanites. In fact, the Hittites of Anatolia are probably not Hittites at all, in that they didn't call themselves that. All right, it's a name that we have given to them later on. They're probably called the Hatsu. All right, but that's not important. How we refer to them nowadays is the Hittites. Okay, they're an Indo-European group, and what all that means is their language or dialect is either from India or Europe, and because they have very similar ways of similar language. Okay, so the Hittites, they're their big issue, their big issue is that they're at the center of the trade lane. Okay, and so they're trying to control the center of the trade lane, and so they're constantly coming into conflict with Egypt and also Assyria, which is on the other side. Um, they uh, they left a lot of writing, so we know quite a bit about their culture. They really have no real interaction prior to the United Kingdom with Israel. They just happen to be in the area. Also, later on, when we hear Hittite in Scripture, so from basically Samuel on, Hittite really has the context of people who live in this region, not necessarily the Hittite culture. It's kind of like saying, you're an American. All right. Well, okay. What kind of American are you? Right? Are you a Texan or a Californian? Right? Or first generation, second generation? All right. So there's just a whole bunch of different people living in this region, and so later on, Scripture is just kind of referring to them all as Hittites. Right? Okay. All right. They ran into, and we'll get into this in a few minutes, but their demise came from a group of people called the Sea People, right? And so the Sea People came in and wiped out the Hittites. They also attacked the Egyptians, which was another reason for Egypt's demise. Now you can see why it's hard to speak about things in a linear fashion, because there's so many different factors going on here. But the bottom line is that during our time frame that we're going to be discussing, the major player of the Hittites ends up being completely wiped out. Yeah, go ahead. Good question. If you can tell us, then you could probably make you win the prize, because nobody knows. I'll give you a theory. I'll give you a theory in a second when we get there. But yeah, no, that's what the historians have been trying to figure out for a long, long time. We just know they existed. Okay. All right, and so the final big cat in the game are the Assyrians. Okay. All right. So the Assyrian Empire is an ancient empire. It's been around for a long time. They've been at war with what would become the Babylonian Empire, so on their south. So Babylon is somewhere in this area. Nineveh is up here, all right? And so the Assyrian Empire sort of occupies this territory right here on the Fertile Crescent. It's very fluid because the Babylonians are not really strong enough to take out the Assyrians until much, much later in history, but they don't ever really go away, and so they're sort of fighting back and forth for a while. And then, of course, the Assyrians are also in contact and constantly fighting with the Hittites. And so just prior to our time frame, there's a big, strong king named Tiglath-Pileser, right? He shows up. This is not Tiglath-Pileser III that shows up much later on in Scripture that wipes out the northern kingdom, right? This is Tiglath-Pileser the First. If you're looking for a baby name, that's the one, right? All right, and so he's a strong king. He gathers the empire together. He subdues the Babylonians. He goes to war with the Hittites, takes a lot of their territory. In fact, Assyria's attack on the Hittites is one of the reasons why the Sea Peoples are able to actually overcome them, because by that time the Hittites had become relatively marginalized because the Assyrians were expanding. Problem was, as it always is, he died, right? And guess who fought over the throne, right? All of his sons, right? And so the Assyrian Empire essentially destabilized at that point. It had a whole series of kings. It stays around for about another 125 years or so, but during that whole time, it's just really a big mess, and that stays that way until after King Solomon dies, all right? And then, of course, after King Solomon dies, all the big cats come back into the game, all right? And so you have this period of time, all right, where God brings about the United Kingdom, and there's this massive growth and cultural revival in Israel, all right? And then the kingdom falls apart, and then all of the big players come back into the game, all right? And so that's how that sort of plays out. Neo-Assyria, which is the new Assyria, which takes northern Israel into exile. They come back in 911 BC. All right, and so that time frame in between is really the time frame we're talking about here. So we have the Assyrian Empire over here. Okay. All right. So so one more big player in the game. Okay, and that is the Sea Peoples. Okay. All right. So the Trojan War, all right, happens in 1190. All right. Okay. Now you're going to go, what? I thought the Trojan War was a myth. All right. The answer to that question is probably not. All right. Probably something happened. All right. We don't know where Troy was. We don't know. All of the factors involved in it. Whether Homer was, writing fictional accounts or based on history, or whether or not it was actually true history. But something happened during this time frame in the Aegean Sea, right? Okay. There's lots of economic collapse during that time frame. And then at the same time, we get what we call the Sea People, all right? And the Sea People come in and sweep into the Mediterranean, and they start taking over all kinds of stuff, all right? And so we know from history that the Greeks were sea people. They knew how to use boats, right? They attacked people with their ships. They had all kinds of stuff, going on with the sea, and so it sort of makes sense that that's who they are. Problem is, they didn't really leave any records behind. The only records that we have of the Sea People are the records of the people who were attacked by them. All right, and so for the most part, what historians think is that. Either as a result of this battle in Troy, or the result of economic factors in Greece, or a combination of the two, things got really bad in the Aegean region, and the Sea People migrated into the Eastern Mediterranean, all right, and then took over a bunch of places. Okay. So again, I already mentioned the Sea People wiped out the Hittites. All right, so that we know. In 1208 BC, they attacked Egypt, and according to the Egyptian king, who isn't going to tell you that he lost, all right, they beat back the Sea People. However, this is also the same time, like we talked about, the Egyptian monarchy becomes destabilized. Okay, and so whether they actually were able to do anything, whether the Egyptians defeated them or not, undoubtedly their presence and the attack that they had on them caused at least some destabilization of the Egyptian empire. All right, and so at this time, the empire in Egypt splits up. Okay, and isn't a player in the game anymore. Okay. All right. Again, like I said, no one really knows who they are, but they really messed everything up, whoever they are. Okay. They really destabilized the region. Go ahead. Good question. And actually, good question. I think the answer is yes and no. People think they became some of the other players that we're going to talk about, the smaller players in the game. Okay. And by and large, the historians think that they were in there to settle, to take over and become that region. Okay, so that's the big picture. Let's look at the little picture. All right. Any questions about the big picture? There's a lot of fascinating books you can read on all of that, but especially about Egypt. I don't know if you all know this, but a lot of Israel history is dated and connected to Egyptian history. This is how we know how things are, or where things are, because it's a desert. It's dry there. Things preserve much better in Egypt than they do in other places. Okay. All right. So now we're going to go to the small players, and so we're going to use this map right here. All right. And so this map is going to just sort of give us a lot of the different players that are in and around Israel. And this is not all of them. Okay, there's a lot of ites that we're going to run into, and we'll talk about those as we run into them. But these are the major players, and you can see on the map here. This is the one with the one without the tribal separate the tribal areas. So this is the one with just the green. And you can see on there where the big capitalized letters are. These are the players that we're going to be talking about. So we're going to just start on the top left, and we're going to just work our way around counterclockwise. All right, so the first group is the Phoenicians. Okay, I'll bring my paper over here because I know I'm going to misspell this one. All right. So the Phoenicians, all right, are even at this time, they're a maritime kingdom. Okay, they're not actually, this group of people is not actually interested in conquering lots of land and territory. They're interested in trade. All right, they're interested in controlling trade, and it's interesting because this group of people never really goes away in history. No matter who owns the territory, the Phoenicians are still there. All right. And so that's likely because when the Hittites would come in, they would say, hey, you want to use our ports? And then the Egyptians would come in and beat the Hittites back, and they would say, hey, you want to trade with us? All right. And so even in the time of King Solomon, we read that he has an alliance with the Phoenicians so that they can bring timber so that he can build the temple, right? And so the Phoenicians never really go away, all right? They're even still around in the New Testament, okay? So this is from Matthew 25 or Matthew 15. All right. And Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and was crying, have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon. And then the similar account in Mark 7 says this, and from there he arose and went away to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And then he entered a house and did not want anyone to know, yet he could not be hidden. But immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard him and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast out the demon. All right, and so here you have these two similar accounts. All right, and it tells us in the Mark account that she was a Syrophoenician. All right, so the Phoenicians are still there, and then in the Matthew account it tells us that she's a Canaanite. And so this brings me to the point that we're getting at here, is that the Phoenicians are probably a remnant of the Canaanite Empire. All right, okay, the Canaanite people. All right. And so it's just a people group undoubtedly within the Canaanites. Now, we shouldn't think of the Canaanites as a single group of people because they probably weren't. And so when we look at the different ites that we're going to run into, the Jebusites, the Hivites, and so on and so forth, these are all just different Canaanite peoples. So Canaan is a land, and the Phoenicians are probably just a Canaanite group in there. And they are a group that never goes away. Okay? Also, it's also good to point out they may have had some sort of either trading deals or just some sort of cultural connection with the Sea Peoples, right? Because they seem to have weathered that storm, right? They don't seem to have fallen off the map or be taken over by them, all right? And so they just sort of get through that. Okay, the Philistines. All right, so this is Philistia. So the Philistines are down here. Okay, so they're on the coastal plains here on the bottom. A lot of people think these are the Sea people. It's probably a lot more complicated than that, all right? But they do show up right around this time, all right? So they do show up in this territory in that time. So it's possible some other potentials are, assuming that the Egyptians were right about defeating the Sea people, these people might have been some of those that were captured, and they could have just been repopulated there by the Egyptians. Moving mass deportation of people was a big thing back in that time, and so that's a possibility. Again, it's probably a lot more complicated than that. What we do know is the Philistines show up in the book of Judges, right? Because Samson fights them, all right, and so they're there during that time. Again, this is right at the time when the Sea Peoples would have been attacking the area. All right, and so and these are going to be the major enemies that Israel is going to be facing during the entire book of Samuel. All right, this is what the major antagonist in the game. And so Goliath comes from this group of people, right? So he's a Philistine, all right, and so there's this so there's a lot of things that sort of play into this. Okay, and again, they never really go away, all right? Well, that's not true. They never really get wiped out by the Israelites, okay? They stick around until 609 BC, all right? And that's when the Assyrian Empire comes in and wipes everybody out, all right? Okay? And so they fall off the face of the map with the rest of Israel at that point, okay? So they're probably deported just like everybody else is, right? And so they disappear from history at that point. Okay, next group of people. All right, they're down here close to the wilderness. All right, these are the Edomites. Okay. All right, so anybody know who the Edomites are? No. Okay, so the Edomites are descendants of Esau, right? So Jacob's brother. Okay, Genesis 32:3. And Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau, his brother, in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. Okay, but Israel has a sort of negative history with Edom. All right, in the Exodus, Edom was strong enough to prevent Israel from entering into its territory, and so Moses asked the king of Edom if he could pass through, and he said no. Okay, and so this is Numbers 20, verses 14. Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom. Thus says your brother Israel, you know all the hardships we have met. And he goes on and talks about it. And then Edom says, nope, you can't come through. All right, and so Israel has to end up going around. Okay. So Edom shows up in the book of Samuel as one of the enemies that Saul is going to end up fighting. Okay. All right. And then we have the Moabites. They're just to the north of Edom, Moab. Okay. Anybody know who the Moabites are? They are the descendants of Lot. Remember Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham's nephew, right? And so what happens to Lot? Sodom and Gomorrah get destroyed, but Lot flees with his two daughters. They go into a cave, and what happens? This is Genesis 19. Thus both the daughters of Lot became pregnant by their father. The firstborn bore a son called his name Moab. He is the father of the Moabites to this day. The younger also bore a son and called his name Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites to this day. Okay. All right, so in the Exodus, after Israel is starting to move into the Promised Land, the Moabites try to stop them, but they are defeated. This is the story of Balaam and the donkey, right? So the king tries to get King Balak tries to get Balaam to curse the Israelites, but instead Balaam ends up blessing them. All right, and so they get defeated by Israel, and Israel ends up moving through there. For them, they eventually become a vassal of the Assyrian Empire, and by the time Rome has come around, they don't exist anymore. There's no cultural difference between them and everyone else, right? And so, just kind of like a good example would be Germans in Texas, right? Okay, and so 100 years ago, there was a distinction between Germans and everybody else in Texas, right? But now there is not, right? Okay, we're all just in Texas, okay? And so that's kind of how that plays out. And so during the time of Moses and the time of Samuel, there was a distinction between the Moabites and everyone around them. But but by the time the Assyrian or the Roman Empire comes around, they're just part of the sort of milieu of everyone around them. Okay. All right. The next group there is the Ammonites. They too are descendants of Lot's other daughter. Okay. And interestingly enough, when Israel is marching into the wilderness, or marching into from the wilderness into the Promised Land, God puts the Ammonites off limits. Okay, so he doesn't tell them to wipe them out, and he says, and when you, this is Deuteronomy 2, he says, and when you approach the territory of the people of Ammon, do not harass them or contend with them, for I will not give you any of the land of the people of Ammon as a possession, because I have given it to the sons of Lot for a possession. All right, and so God says their kingdom is off limits. However, in the book of Judges, Joshua ends up taking their land anyway. All right. You go, well, how does that work out? Are they just, well, first you could just say they're disobeying God, but actually what ends up happening is a king called Og, who is not a Ammonite, comes in and defeats the Ammonites, and so he takes half of their land. Okay, the Ammonites aren't much of a factor in 1 Samuel, all right, but they do show up in 2 Samuel. All right. They do seem to have survived the Assyrian and Babylonian conquests, and they actually show up in history later on, about 160 BC, when they come into conflict with the Maccabees. And the Maccabees are the Israel nationalist group who are trying to get rid of the Greeks during that time frame. Okay, and then like the Moabites, by the time of the Roman Empire, they don't culturally exist anymore. Right? They're just a people that live in that area. Okay. All right, and then the final group that we'll look at here is Aram. Okay. All right, and so by the time of Samuel, this is more of a territory than a people. Okay. So they were the Aramites, okay? And so they have biblical connection. They're the sons of Shem, who is one of Noah's sons, okay? And Genesis 10 says the sons of Shem, Elam, Asher, Arpachshad, Lud, and Aram, okay? And then also the other big biblical connection here is that Arameans, this is where most of the most of the wives of the patriarchs came from, okay? Just for example, Genesis 25, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padaram, the sister of Laban, the Aramean, to be his wife, okay? And so the patriarchs would send their sons or representatives to go up into Aram to get a daughter for them to marry, and so that's the connection there. But again, by this time, even by the time of Samuel, this is really just a sort of area. It's not a culture or anything like that. It's just the area of Aramea, Aram. All right, and also by this time, it's also largely under control of the Assyrian empires. And just as a sort of trivia piece of information, it's where we get the word Aramaic from. All right, and so the language of Aramaic derives from this people group. Okay. All right, and so those are the major players and the sort of the mice, and so the major players are out of the game, and so all of these players, to some extent, are going to be contending for the big prize in the book of Samuel, right, which is the land of milk and honey, right, and so that's what they're fighting over. That's what's going on here. Everybody's trying to control this land in between. And that's an important piece to remember. A lot of times we look at Scripture, we look at it from a standpoint of faith, which we, by the way, should, all right? And we see people and we go, why are you doing that? That doesn't make sense. God is going to smote you, all right? Okay? All right? But the reality is, they're in these political situations, right, where they are trying to act through reason for the most part. I'll give you an example. Saul, and we'll read about this in 1 Samuel. Saul is the king. He's got his army around him. He's being pressed by the Philistines, and they're supposed to wait 7 days for Samuel to show up to make a sacrifice. Well, Samuel's late. He doesn't come on time. All right? So what does Saul do? he goes, well, I'm going to make the sacrifice myself, right? Okay? And so that seems a very reasonable thing to do in the face of what's going on around him, all right? But it's not what God wanted him to do. And so we know that when we look back at that text and we say, Saul, you're an idiot. You shouldn't have done that, okay? But the reason why a lot of people do the things they do is because of the political situations that we see outside of it, all right? God wants us to trust him. Another situation, and this is an even better situation, and this shows up in Joshua's conquest of the Holy Land, or the Promised Land, right? So God says, "Go take Jericho." Well, how does He tell us to do it? Well, march around the city 7 times, blowing horns. Oh, what? That doesn't make any sense. Not only does that not seem like it's going to work, it seems like they're going to shoot arrows at us, and then also, we're going to sort of lose the tactical advantage of surprise. They're going to know how many people we have because we're going to march around the city for 7 days. That doesn't make any sense at all, right? And so, like I said, when you see people making these decisions, a lot of times, like I said, we look at them and go, "Well, what are you doing?" But the reality is, they're doing what they think is best in that situation. Unfortunately, what's going on is they're also not trusting in God, and that's really the big issue here. Okay, so just a sort of real short overview for Israel. We're not gonna go into their history in any depth because we talked about it as it was relate here. But just a timeline. So 2200 to 1900 BC. All right, is the age of the patriarchs. Okay. 1850 BC. This puts them in Egypt. Okay. 1446, like I said, this is the Exodus. Okay. 1406, this is the conquest of the Promised Land. Exodus. Conquest. And 1350, this is the time of the judges. Okay. It's not, and that time, we have a relative understanding of that time, but the exact times are hard to judge exactly because we don't have all the years for the judges, right? It doesn't, the book of Judges don't say how long each judge ruled for. And sometimes they don't say how long how long in intermediate period was. Okay, and so with this, our book, 1 Samuel, begins. Okay, and so this is the start of our book, the 1 Samuel. Okay, all right. So then that gets us into the actual book itself. So who is the author of the book? What's that? Unknown. It's not Samuel. All right. Okay. All right. And we know that. Why? Because Samuel dies in chapter 25. Okay. And so he couldn't have written the remaining 6 chapters of the book if he died in chapter 25. All right. And so this is, by the way, not a problem. Okay. It's not a big issue who wrote the book. It doesn't make it any less the word of God just because we don't know who wrote it. All right. But having said that, it's very likely that either the first 25 chapters were written by Samuel, or at least based off of the things that he had written. All right, okay, because 1 Chronicles 29 tells us this. It says, "Now the acts of King David, from the first to the last, are written in the Chronicles of Samuel the seer, and the Chronicles of Nathan the prophet, and the Chronicles of Gad the seer." All right. Okay. And seer just means prophet, all right? And so, it's a different word, but it's the way that they spoke about it. Okay. Also, when was it written? All right. Very likely, it was written after the kingdom split apart. All right. And so this is after the death of King Solomon, most likely. 1 Samuel 27, verse 6 says this. So that day Achish gave him Ziklag, which is a city. Therefore Ziklag has belonged to the kings of Judah to this day. Well, the kings of Judah didn't exist until after the split, right? Because they were the kings of Israel, right? And then after the kingdom split, right, the northern kingdom became Israel and the southern kingdom became Judah, all right? And so very likely this story was written, or not story, but this the book of Samuel was written after the kingdom split out. Okay, again, this is not really a problem, all right, because this is the word of God that comes down to us. It doesn't really matter who wrote it or when it was written. Okay, the purpose of this book, all right. It's going to have several purposes, all right. But the big and larger purpose of this book and any historical book, all right, is to simply tell the story of God's redemption for the people of Israel and for the Gentile world, right? So this is God's story of redemption, and so 1 Samuel is just simply one piece of this larger story. Okay. There are other things, of course, subplots in here. There's a lot of theological ground that we're going to talk about as we go through this. But another thing, too, is we should also be mindful that, especially if this book was written after the split, it was probably written as a rebuke, all right, to the kings of Israel. All right, it was probably shown to them or written for them, all right, as the empire is declining, as it's divided, right? And so they're writing this book to show the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, all right, what happens when you disobey God, all right? See what happened to Saul? See what happened to David? See what happened to Solomon? Not Solomon's in the book of Kings, but anyway, but you see all they're going through and highlighting all of these problems, and so very likely this book even had a political side to it, right? So that they're writing it for those around, or for those who are ruling the kingdom at that point. All right, so let's talk about the structure of the book, and then I think that'll probably be the end of it for today. And then next week we will actually get into the book itself. Okay. All right. So okay. Okay, so it comes down to us like this: 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. Okay, but that's actually not how it was written. Okay, it is actually written this way. Okay, it's just the book of Samuel. All right. In fact, it's not even the book of Samuel. All right. All right. It's the book of Kings. Actually, it's not even that. We're actually not sure what it's originally called. Okay. All right. So part of the issue too is just the length of scrolls, right? The cost of actually producing this work. Okay, so the book of Samuel, first and second Samuel, first and second Kings are really one work. All right, okay, whether they were on one scroll or not, they are a continuation from the four books. Okay. The Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which was produced, I think it was 270 or something like that. It labeled the books of Samuel, or the books of Samuel and the book of Kings, first, second, third, and fourth Kings. Okay, and so that's how the Septuagint talks about these 4 books. Again, it has to do with the length, right? We don't have paper like this back and then, and so you had to have a really big cow, right? Or I don't actually know how they make papyrus scrolls, but you had to have something really big to actually to write all of this stuff out on. And so I know I showed the ladies this, but in ancient, I'll just write it right here. In ancient Israel, or in ancient times, this is how they wrote. Okay, it would be in all caps. That's how they wrote. There's no spaces. All right. Okay, and it's all caps. All right, and so as you look at that, you're like, what on earth? That's just word salad, right? Okay. All right, but they did that because of the space available to write these things, okay? And so, to be honest with you, and I told this before, but the more you get used to just looking at that, the more you would get used to seeing where the words are supposed to be divided at, right? And so that's how they wrote, okay? And so the books come down to us just for practical reasons with different titles. And then Jerome, when he writes the Vulgate, the Latin Vulgate, he is actually the one that gives us the title 1 Samuel. Okay, and so that's where we get our modern labeling for this particular book, 1 Samuel. Okay, all right. So we're really going to just focus on 1 Samuel, even though it's a part of a larger collection. All right. 1 Samuel is really divided into 4 parts. Okay, and there are 3 characters in here. Okay, you have Samuel the prophet, and that's why the book is entitled Samuel. Okay, Samuel. All right. Samuel, okay, and I think I didn't write this down. I think this is chapters, and I won't write it down, but I think it's 1 to 7. It really focuses on Samuel, okay? All right, and then we have Saul, okay, and finally we have David, okay? All right, and so these are the 3 main figures in the book, all right? Okay. Now, the movements in the book, all right, really go like this, okay? All right, and this actually continues on into the next set of texts as well. All right, and this is and so what we have is Samuel kind of works through this whole narrative here. All right, but this is the rise and then the fall of Saul. Okay, and then this is the rise and the eventual fall of David. Now, you might say, well, David died king. All right, well, when we get to 2 Samuel, you'll see all the problems David had when he died king. All right, that's true, but there was a lot of issues going on here. And so this is sort of the movement of the book, all right? Okay, and so, and just a sort of a spoiler, all right? Before the book of Samuel, all right, who's king of Israel? God is king of Israel, all right? Okay, so, and what do they want in the book of Samuel? A king, all right? And so this is the story of Israel getting what it wants, okay? And so then we'll see how that all plays out. And if we move from first to second Samuel, and then from 1 to 2 Kings, you'll see how ultimately this whole king thing works out for them in the end. Not well.